In the quiet hills of eastern Kentucky, more than half a century after the Sutton farmhouse was torn apart by gunfire and fear, another family found themselves living a nightmare that seemed to echo the past. The year was 2012, and Hellier was no longer the bustling coal town it had once been. The mines had long since closed, leaving behind miles of abandoned shafts that twisted deep into the Appalachian earth. Wooden houses sagged along empty roads, paint peeling, windows clouded by years of dust. For those who remained, life was quiet, harsh, and isolated. And yet, in the shadows of those hollowed mountains, something seemed to stir again. It began with an email. The words, desperate and raw, were sent to a small group of paranormal investigators who had made a name for themselves by chasing unexplained phenomena across America. The sender was anonymous at first, though later it became clear it came from a family struggling to hold on to sanity in the face of something they couldn't explain. The email described small beings, hairless, pale, with round black eyes that reflected light in the night. They surrounded the house the family claimed. They tapped on windows. They knocked on doors. They frightened the children so badly that no one could sleep. "We don't know who else to turn to," the email read. "The police will think we're crazy. Our neighbors already laugh at us. Please, someone has to believe us. Someone has to see what we're living through." At first, the investigators assumed it was a prank. The internet was full of hoaxes and strange tales written for amusement. But then more emails came. They weren't written like fiction. They were disjointed, full of misspellings, written in panic late at night. Attached were blurry photographs taken from inside the house, a smudge of a pale figure by a window, two glinting eyes caught in a flash, strange muddy tracks outside the back door. The investigators hesitated, but the more they read, the more they felt the urgency was real. These people weren't asking for fame. They were begging for help. The family's home was perched on the edge of Hellier, not far from the yawning Black, a mouth of an abandoned mine. The mine was a wound in the earth. Its entrance collapsed in places, but its tunnels still running for miles beneath the hills. Locals whispered that strange things lived in those depths. Hunters spoke of hearing cries that weren't animal. Teenagers dared each other to go near the shafts at night, only to run home shaken by voices echoing in the dark. Old-timers remembered older stories of little white men who lived underground, a piece of Kentucky folklore that predated even the Sutton encounter of 1955. Most dismissed these tales as superstition, the way mountain folk explained things they couldn't understand. But for one family in 2012, it was no legend. It was right outside their window. The investigators decided they had to see for themselves. After a long drive through winding Appalachian roads, they arrived at the family's home. The house was small, wooden, its siding weathered grey, surrounded by thick woods that pressed close on every side. It was late afternoon, and the family, parents, two young children and a teenage son, greeted them nervously. The father's hands shook as he lit a cigarette on the porch. His wife looked pale, exhausted. The children clung to her, their eyes wide with fear that didn't look rehearsed. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The curtains were drawn tight. Furniture had been rearranged to block certain windows. A shotgun leaned against the wall near the door. These were not people staging a hoax for attention. These were people barely holding on. That night, the investigators set up cameras around the property. They placed audio recorders in the woods, pointed infrared sensors toward the tree line, and stationed themselves with the family in the living room. The hours crept by, heavy with silence broken only by the chirping of insects and the occasional bark of the family's dog. Midnight passed. Nothing happened. Then, just after 1 in the morning, The dog growled low and bolted to the back door. Everyone froze. The investigators raised their flashlights, their cameras already recording. A tapping sound echoed through the kitchen window, soft, deliberate, like fingernails against glass. One of the children whimpered. The father whispered a curse and clutched the shotgun. And then, through the thin curtain, a face appeared. It was round, pale, with two enormous black eyes that reflected the beam of the flashlight like polished stone. The mother screamed. The father fired. The blast tore through the window, and the figure vanished into the night. The investigators rushed outside, their lights sweeping across the yard. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, near the tree line, several small shapes moved, quick, low to the ground, darting between shadows. One camera caught a brief glint of eyeshine, not like an animal's but high off the ground, steady, deliberate. The woods seemed alive with movement, but nothing solid could be pinned down. When the team played back the audio, they heard faint, scratching, a low hum, and something like whispering voices layered beneath the sound of the wind. By dawn, the family was exhausted. The investigators were shaken. They had expected perhaps nothing at all, or at worst, raccoons or pranksters. But what they saw, what they recorded, defied easy explanation. They stayed another night, and another. Each time, the pattern repeated, tapping on glass, scratching on the roof, eyes shining in the darkness, shots fired into the night, always with no effect, muddy tracks by morning, leading toward the old mine, always back toward the mine. The investigators began to notice other patterns. The beings never entered the house, though they circled it endlessly. They never attacked directly, but they instilled a terror that was almost worse than violence. It was as if they were toying with the family, testing them, wearing them down night after night. One night, the teenage son swore he saw a pale hand with long fingers reach over the gutter of the roof, curling and grasping like claws. Another time, one of the children claimed a face pressed against her bedroom window, smiling. Whether or not she truly saw it, she wet herself in terror and refused to sleep alone for weeks after. The mine loomed larger in the investigators' minds. By day, they hiked toward it, their boots crunching over loose rock and fallen branches. The entrance was fenced off with rusting wire, but gaps allowed them to peer inside. The air that seeped out was cold, damp, and smelled of earth long undisturbed. Their flashlights caught nothing but endless black. Yet several times, as they stood there, they heard something move deep within, a shuffle, a clatter of stone, a sound that stopped the moment they froze to listen. No animals were known to live that deep, not in shafts that had been abandoned for decades. Still, something was there, and every night, the being seemed to return from that same direction. The investigators consulted local history. They learned of miners who vanished decades ago, swallowed by collapses that sealed tunnels forever. They read accounts of cave explorers who spoke of strange lights, phosphorescent glows that danced in the dark. They heard rumors of secret tunnels that connected Hellier to other forgotten towns across Kentucky, an underground labyrinth that no map had ever captured fully. Folklore blended with reality until it was impossible to separate the two. The little white men of legend, the ant people of the Hopi, said to have led humanity through ancient cataclysms. And now, in 2012, a family living on the edge of that mine claimed to see them again. Skeptics suggested owls. Just as in 1955, great horned owls became the convenient explanation. But when investigators compared notes, the differences were glaring. Owls did not tap on glass night after night. Owls did not leave muddy humanoid tracks by the porch. And owls certainly did not move in coordinated groups, circling a house for hours at a time. Others suggested pranksters, but the remoteness of the property and the consistency of the encounters made that unlikely. These people were terrified, and no prankster had ever kept up a hoax for weeks on end without being caught. The family's health began to deteriorate. The mother lost weight from lack of sleep. The father grew increasingly paranoid, pacing the house at night with a rifle in hand. The children cried at every sound, their grades slipping as they stopped attending school regularly. The teenage son became withdrawn, refusing to speak of what he saw. To the investigators, it was clear this family was unraveling. They weren't performing for cameras. They were breaking down. The investigators themselves weren't immune. One member reported nightmares after leaving Helia, dreams of pale figures standing at the foot of his bed. Another swore he felt followed for weeks, hearing knocks on his own window at night, though he lived hundreds of miles away. Whether psychosomatic or real, the effect was undeniable. Whatever was haunting Helia didn't stay neatly within the boundaries of one family's property. It seemed to reach outward, clinging to anyone who came too close. By the third week, the investigators had collected dozens of hours of footage. Most of it showed nothing but darkness, trees swaying in the wind, insects buzzing past lenses. But scattered among the useless footage were moments that chilled them to the bone. A pair of glowing eyes reflecting from behind a tree trunk. A hand-like shape brushing against a window screen. A faint silhouette crossing the yard in under a second, faster than a person could run. And always, the audio carried faint but unexplainable sounds. Whispers, metallic clangs, rhythmic knocks. That seemed intentional. As word spread within the paranormal community, more researchers grew interested. Some dismissed the case as hysteria, recycled folklore in a struggling town desperate for attention. Others, however, believed it was a direct continuation of Kelly Hopkinsville. 57 years apart, two families in rural Kentucky describing the same beings, the same siege, the same futility of gunfire. Coincidence seemed unlikely. A pattern was emerging. For the family in Helia, however, none of this mattered. They weren't interested in theories or folklore. They just wanted it to stop. They wanted their children to sleep. They wanted their home back. But as weeks turned into months, the nightly terror did not fade. If anything, it grew bolder. The beings came closer to the house. The tapping grew louder. The children swore they heard voices whispering their names. One night, the father fired again and again into the trees, only to collapse afterward, sobbing that the bullets didn't matter. "You can't kill what's not alive," he muttered, his face pale, his cigarette trembling between his fingers. The days blurred together for the family. Sleep came in fragments, broken by sudden knocks or the shrill cries of the children jolted awake. Even in the rare hours of daylight, the house carried an air of dread, as if the walls themselves remembered the pounding from outside. The investigators rotated in and out, some staying only a night or two before admitting they could no longer stand the tension. Others remained longer, driven by curiosity and an unshakable sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. Cameras were checked and rechecked. Batteries drained mysteriously fast. Memory cards occasionally corrupted. And, always, the mine loomed like a silent sentinel behind it all, its yawning entrance a reminder that whatever haunted the family came from beneath the earth. On one particularly humid evening, just as the sky sank into violet and the cicadas began their endless drone, the family sat in uneasy silence around the kitchen table. The father's cigarette smoke curled upward in lazy spirals. The mother stared at her hands, her eyes hollow from exhaustion. The children huddled together in the living room, watching cartoons at low volume, as if pretending at normalcy. Then, the sound came again. Tap, 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 on the glass. Everyone froze. The teenage son rose, trembling, and peeked through the curtain. His scream shattered the quiet. He swore that a pale, hairless face with a wide grin was pressed against the glass. The investigators rushed in, flashlights cutting beams across the yard. By the time they reached the window, the figure was gone. But outside, in the dirt, they found prints, small, three-toed impressions pressed deep into the soil, leading once again toward the mine. That discovery shook even the skeptics among the team. They measured the prints. Each was about 8 inches long, wider than a human foot, but unmistakably humanoid in shape. The depth suggested something heavier than a raccoon or dog. Casts were made, photographs taken, but in the back of everyone's minds, a single question pulsed. What could leave such marks, yet vanish without a trace when pursued? The nights grew bolder. One evening, as rain lashed against the roof, the beings returned with unusual persistence. They circled the house, their eyes glowing like lanterns in the dark. Every time the father or one of the investigators aimed a flashlight, the eyes retreated, only to reappear moments later in another direction. A rock struck the side of the house with a hollow thud. Then another. The children screamed as the sound of scratching claws scraped against the tin roof. The father fired his shotgun again and again until the smell of gunpowder filled the air, but the figures seemed unaffected. When the team checked outside, they found fresh gouges in the wooden siding, as if clawed fingers had raked along the walls. Muddy tracks pooled near the porch, but once more, no bodies, no blood. The investigators debated furiously. Some insisted it was a psychological contagion, the stress of isolation creating a shared delusion. But the physical evidence, the prints, the scratches, the recordings, argued otherwise. Others suggested a secret military experiment, that perhaps the mine concealed more than coal. Hellier wasn't far from Fort Campbell, the same base whose military police had responded to Kelly in 1955. Could the government be testing something in these forgotten hills? The theory felt thin, but in the absence of answers, it carried weight. 1. Night. They decided to push further. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a nervous determination, the investigators hiked toward the mine entrance. The family begged them not to go, terrified that whatever lived inside would retaliate, but curiosity outweighed caution. The group pressed on through wet grass and thorny brush until the black mouth of the mine loomed before them. The air grew colder as they approached, a damp chill that raised goosebumps. The flashlights illuminated only a few feet of crumbling rock before the darkness swallowed everything. They stood in silence, listening. And then they heard it. A faint shuffle, a click of stone, like something moving just out of sight. One investigator swore he saw 2 pinpricks of light reflecting deep inside, like eyes. Another caught a low hum on the audio recorder, so faint it was nearly inaudible, yet deliberate enough to be unlike any natural sound. They did not enter the mine. Fear outweighed their resolve. But as they turned back toward the house, several of them reported the uneasy sensation of being watched. That night, the tapping on the windows was louder than ever, as if the beings knew the investigators had ventured too close. The toll on the family worsened. The mother confessed to the investigators that she sometimes wished they had never sent those emails, that bringing strangers into their nightmare had only made the beings angrier. The father became erratic, smoking constantly, muttering to himself. One of the children refused to eat. The teenage son scribbled drawings of pale figures in his notebook, dozens of them, all identical, surrounding a house under a black sky. The investigators recognized the signs of trauma. Whether or not the beings were real, the damage they inflicted was undeniable. The case began attracting whispers online. Within the UFO and paranormal communities, talk of the Kentucky Goblins resurfaced with vigor. Some saw the Hellier reports as direct confirmation that the Sutton encounter had not been an isolated incident. Others dismissed it as folklore reanimated for the internet age. But a few dug deeper, pointing out the uncanny parallels, the glowing eyes, the metallic sounds when shot, the siege-like behavior, the proximity to mines or caves. Too many details, aligned across decades to be coincidence. To them, Hellier was not a new story. It was a continuation. The investigators pressed on, though doubt gnawed at them. They reviewed every second of footage, slowing frames to catch fleeting shapes. They compared tracks, measured scratches, analyzed audio spectrograms. They interviewed neighbors, most of whom dismissed the family as paranoid, though a few admitted to hearing strange cries from the woods at night. One old man recalled stories his grandfather told of little white men in the hills, beings who lived underground and came out when the world grew too quiet. "They've been here longer than we have," the man said, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "And they'll be here after we're gone." By the second month, the investigators themselves began to fray. One night, while reviewing footage in a motel, one member swore he heard tapping on his window. Another reported waking to find his laptop open, though he had shut it before sleeping. They argued, snapped at each other, drank heavily to cope with the constant pressure. The line between documenting the phenomenon and being consumed by it grew thin. More than once, they considered abandoning the case entirely. But each time, the family begged them to stay, their voices shaking with desperation. "If you leave," the mother whispered one night, "we'll die here. We'll die from fear, even if they never touch us." The most chilling night came late in the summer. The family had tried to act normal, gathering in the living room for board games, pretending the outside world did not exist. The investigators were present, cameras rolling quietly. Then, without warning, every light in the house flickered and died. The children screamed as the room plunged into blackness. The father fumbled for a flashlight, his hands shaking. When the beam finally cut through the dark, it illuminated the window, and there, pressed against the glass, was a pale face with enormous eyes staring directly inside. Another face appeared at the next window, then another. Within seconds, the house was surrounded, multiple sets of eyes glinting in the flashlight beams. The father fired blindly, the deafening blasts echoing through the rooms. Glass shattered, curtains ripped. The investigators shouted, trying to record, but panic reigned. The children wailed. The mother clutched them to her chest, sobbing. For nearly 20 minutes, chaos consumed the small wooden house, until as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The lights flickered back on. The windows were shattered, the walls scarred with fresh bullet holes. But outside, there was nothing. No bodies, no tracks, only silence. That night broke something in the family. The next morning, the father packed bags into their old truck. The mother gathered clothes and food for the children. With tears in her eyes, she told the investigators they were leaving. They would not return. They would go to relatives in another state, anywhere but here. The house, their home for years, was abandoned within hours. The investigators stood in the yard, stunned as the family drove away, their truck disappearing down the dirt road in a cloud of dust. The silence that followed was absolute. The investigators returned to the house several times in the weeks after, but it was never the same. The beings did not reappear, at least not for them. The property sat empty, its windows boarded, its walls still bearing the scars of that final night. Locals avoided it, muttering about those crazy people who had imagined monsters in the hills, but the investigators could not forget what they had seen. The glowing eyes, the prints in the dirt, the sounds that no animal should make. For them, the Hellier case was no hoax. It was a haunting, a siege, a continuation of something older and far stranger than anyone wanted to admit. Even now, years later, those who were there speak of Hellier with unease. Some say the beings retreated back into the mines, content to wait until another family unknowingly built their lives atop their hidden world. Others believe they never left at all, that they are still there, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. And the investigators who dared to document it remain divided. Some continue to research, chasing every whisper of goblins in the hills. Others quit the field entirely, shaken into silence. But none ever forgot the night the Kentucky Goblins returned. The house in Hellier stood abandoned, its windows boarded, its doors chained. But its presence lingered like a scar across the quiet hills. For weeks after the family fled, locals avoided the place, crossing the road rather than pass too close. Hunters whispered of strange cries echoing from the trees. Teenagers dared each other to sneak up at night, but most lost their nerve at the sight of the looming mine entrance, black as a tomb in the moonlight. The investigators who had documented the ordeal found themselves restless. They carried with them hours of footage, audio filled with unexplainable noises, photographs of tracks and eyeshine. Yet none of it amounted to proof. Every frame could be dismissed as blurry, every sound as distorted wind, every print as the misinterpretation of mud. They had seen with their own eyes, but in the cold light of day, even their memories began to feel fragile, slipping toward the realm of dreams. Still, the parallels to 1955 were undeniable. Two families, 57 years apart, in rural Kentucky. Both claimed small, pale beings besieged their homes. Both fired weapons into the night. Both were mocked, dismissed, eventually driven out. And both incidents centered not on open farmland or busy towns, but on the edges of caves, mines, and tunnels. It was this detail that consumed the investigators after Hellier. The earth itself seemed to play a role. The beings came from underground, returned to underground, left behind no bodies, no trace except fear and memory. The investigators began to scour folklore, searching for answers not in laboratories but in the stories passed down through generations. They found that Kentucky's folklore stretched back long before coal miners dug into the Appalachian ridges. Indigenous peoples told of small subterranean beings who lived in caverns beneath the hills. The Cherokee spoke of moon-eyed people, pale, small, with large eyes who could not withstand the sun. Legends claimed they emerged at night, traveling through secret tunnels, and retreated with the dawn. The Hopi, far to the west, told of the ant people who guided humanity through cataclysms by sheltering them underground. To skeptics, these were myths explaining the harsh realities of life, but to those who had stared into the dark eyes at Hellier, the similarities were too precise to ignore. The mine itself became the focal point of endless speculation. Maps of its tunnels revealed miles of shafts, many collapsed, others never fully charted. Rumors circulated of caverns stretching beyond the miner's reach, deep pockets of earth untouched by human light. Some researchers suggested that such hidden spaces could harbor unknown species, adapted to darkness, living undisturbed until human expansion forced them closer to the surface. If fish could thrive in blind caves, if insects evolved to navigate pitch-black tunnels, why not something larger, something humanoid? It was not proof, but it was a possibility that haunted every discussion. Skeptics, of course, sharpened their knives. They argued that the Hellier case was a textbook example of mass hysteria fueled by folklore and internet culture. The family, they said, was isolated, stressed, perhaps mentally unwell. The investigators, hungry for a story, amplified their fears. Blurry photographs and muddy prints were not evidence, only misinterpretations of natural events. Owls again became the fallback explanation, as they had in 1955. The glowing eyes, the silent flight, the unnerving screeches. It was easier to imagine birds than beings, but the skeptics' theories faltered when pressed against the raw consistency of testimony. Too many details matched too closely. Too many people across decades described the same things. Among believers, the theories split into camps. Some argued that the beings were extraterrestrial, visitors who crashed or landed in 1955 and returned in 2012. The glowing object Billy Ray Taylor saw streaking across the sky fit the UFO narrative, as did the strange lights investigators glimpsed near the mine. If they were aliens, perhaps the mine served as shelter, a hidden base in the wilderness. Others leaned toward the subterranean hypothesis. The goblins were not visitors, but natives, a species that had lived in caves long before settlers arrived. In this view, the glowing object in 1955 was a coincidence, a meteor mistaken for a craft. The true horror was that the beings weren't alien at all. They were homegrown, a shadow civilization living beneath our feet. More radical voices suggested interdimensional theories. The whispers, the flickering lights, the way the beings seemed to vanish without a trace. All of it, they said, pointed to rifts in reality itself. The caves and mines were not just physical spaces, but gateways. Thin places where the fabric between worlds wore down. What the Suttons saw, what the Helia family endured, were glimpses of beings from another dimension bleeding into ours. These theories were impossible to prove. But for those who had stared into the endless black of the mine, they carried a disturbing allure. The investigators returned to their lives, but none left unmarked. One carried the nightmares for years, waking to visions of pale figures clustered outside his window. Another swore he felt watched whenever he traveled through wooded hills, as if the goblins followed him beyond Helia. They presented their findings at conferences, uploaded reports to online forums, debated late into the night with skeptics and believers alike. But no consensus emerged. Helia remained unresolved, a mirror image of Kelly, destined to linger, in the liminal space between hoax and truth. For the family who fled, life never returned to normal. They refused interviews, declined offers from media outlets. When tracked down years later, they would only say that they never went back, never wanted to see that house again. The children grew up with scars, invisible but deep, their childhoods etched with fear of tapping on glass. Their parents carried the weight of ridicule, just as the Suttons had before them. In small towns, reputations linger. Once branded as crazy, it was nearly impossible to escape the label. And yet, within the UFO community, Helia became a cornerstone case. Researchers cited it alongside Roswell, Kelly, Rendlesham, Phoenix. It represented a continuity of phenomena stretching across generations. The beings were not confined to a single night in 1955. They returned, and might return again. Some even claimed sightings in other parts of Kentucky, whispering of figures glimpsed near caves, strange lights seen in the forests. Whether coincidence, exaggeration, or truth, the legend grew. The curious thing about legends is how they adapt. In the 1950s, the Suttons' goblins were mocked in newspapers, turned into cartoons with pointed ears and glowing eyes. By 2012, the internet carried the story. Forums buzzed with speculation. Memes spread the word faster than print ever could. The ridicule remained, but so did fascination. The Kentucky Goblins were no longer just local folklore. They had become part of a global tapestry of unexplained encounters, woven into the same fabric as greys, reptilians, and shadow people. And perhaps that was the most unsettling truth. Whatever name we gave them, whatever explanation we clung to, the beings kept appearing, refusing to vanish into obscurity. Late in 2012, a rumor surfaced that another family, miles from Helia, reported similar events: tapping on windows, glowing eyes in the woods, livestock frightened without cause. The story never reached mainstream media, but within the circles that cared, it was enough to confirm suspicions. The phenomenon was not isolated. It was part of something larger, spreading like threads across the Appalachians. Some traced the sightings back through centuries to coal miners lost in the depths, to Cherokee legends of moon-eyed people. Others pointed further, to a human fear older than words, the terror of the dark, of what waits just beyond the firelight. The Helia. Investigators sometimes debated among themselves what they would do if the beings returned. Would they re-enter the mine, face the shadows directly? Or would they, like the family, flee and never look back? The question remained hypothetical, but it carried the weight of inevitability, because deep down, none of them believed the story was finished. The goblins had returned once. They could return again. Years later, one of the investigators revisited the site alone. The house was gone, torn down by new owners who refused to live there. The land was overgrown, weeds choking the foundation. The mine still yawned nearby, silent and damp. He stood there at dusk, listening to the cicadas drone, the frogs croak, the wind rattle the leaves. It was ordinary, almost peaceful. But as the light faded, he swore he heard it again. Tap, 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 faint, deliberate, against the air itself. He turned, heart racing, flashlight cutting across the trees. For a moment, he thought he saw eyes, large, black, unblinking, watching from the shadows. And just like that, they were gone. The Helia case never resolved. It lingered in the uneasy space between history and myth, proof and imagination. But for those who lived it, those who recorded it, it was real. As real as the bullet holes in the Sutton farmhouse in 1955. As real as the trembling hands of a father clutching a shotgun in 2012. As real as the terror in a child's eyes at the sound of tapping on glass. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the Kentucky Goblins. Not whether they are aliens, owls, or hallucinations, but the undeniable fact that ordinary families in ordinary houses endured something so extraordinary it could never be forgotten. What haunts us is not the proof we lack, but the possibility we cannot escape, that beneath the green hills of Kentucky, in the mines and caves that stretch endlessly into the dark, something still waits, something small, something pale, something that knows our fear. And when the night grows still, when the house grows quiet, it comes to the window, it taps, it watches. It reminds us that the story never ended. Months passed after the family abandoned their home in Helia, yet the story refused to die. In the hills of eastern Kentucky, silence often settles like a blanket over old wounds. But this wound lingered. The mine still gaped behind the property, its entrance sagging with rust and collapse, a place avoided by hunters and children alike. The investigators returned occasionally, drawn as if by compulsion. Though the house was empty, they claimed the land still carried a charge, an almost physical weight in the air, as though the ground remembered. More than one swore that at dusk, the cicadas fell quiet too suddenly, and the shadows around the mine grew thicker than they should. It was easy to imagine pale faces just beyond the reach of fading light. The Helia case spread quietly online, whispered across forums, dissected in podcasts, retold in late-night videos. Most dismissed it outright. Just another Kelly copycat, skeptics said. Folklore rehashed for the internet. But among those who followed such things, the echoes were undeniable. It wasn't just that the Helia family described pale beings, or that they lived by a mine. It was the rhythm of the terror itself, the nightly tapping, the glowing eyes at the window, the futility of gunfire, the mockery that followed. The same cycle had repeated in 1955, and now again in 2012. And some whispered that it had happened in places the newspapers never bothered to cover. One investigator, restless and unable to let the matter go, began collecting stories from other Appalachian towns. He found scattered reports of families plagued by figures in the night. In one hollow, a farmer claimed his chickens were killed without wounds. their bodies left neatly arranged outside the coop. In another, a woman reported her child woke screaming of men with shiny eyes scratching at the window. None of these made headlines. They were passed along in hushed tones, dismissed by sheriffs, ridiculed by neighbors. But together, they painted a chilling picture. The goblins had not stayed in Kelly or Helia. They moved like a shadow through the mountains, appearing when no one expected, vanishing before anyone could prove a thing. The deeper the investigator dug, the older the stories became. He uncovered faded newspaper clippings from the 1930s, describing miners who swore they saw strange men in the shafts before collapses. He read transcripts of oral histories from the 19th century, where settlers spoke of moon-eyed people hiding in caves. And still older, in indigenous accounts, the legends carried the same motifs. Small, pale figures with large eyes, living underground, emerging at night. It was as though the Kentucky goblins were not an isolated phenomenon, but a thread running back through centuries, stitching folklore and fear into a seamless whole. For the family who fled Helia, life never healed. In rare moments of candor, relatives confided that the children still woke screaming years later, that the father drank heavily, that the mother refused to live near woods again. They avoided cameras, avoided reporters, but their absence spoke volumes. No one who invents a hoax runs from it for the rest of their life. They left because they could not bear the memory. The skeptics, however, never relented. To them, every photograph was blurry by design, every recording tainted by expectation. If the goblins were real, they argued, why no bodies? Why no clear footage? Why nothing a scientist can hold in hand? And that question hung like a stone around every believer's neck. But believers countered with another. If it's all imagination, how do you explain the bullet holes, the consistency, the fear that leaves families uprooted from their homes? The debate circled endlessly, with no resolution, because perhaps none could be found. The goblins existed in a place beyond proof, a liminal space where folklore and reality blur. What unsettled the investigators most was not what they saw in Helia, but what they felt. Again and again, they described a sense of intelligence behind the encounters. The tapping was not random. It was deliberate, playful, mocking. The figures did not charge, did not attack. They lingered, watching, testing boundaries. It was as if they understood the effect of their presence and reveled in it. One investigator wrote in his journal, "They are not trying to kill us. They are trying to make us afraid. Fear itself is the point." That thought was perhaps more terrifying than any alien hypothesis predators kill. But what kind of being lives only to provoke fear, to circle in the night, to remind us of our helplessness? Speculation grew darker still. Some suggested the goblins were not physical beings at all, but manifestations, projections of something, older, perhaps even interdimensional entities that slip through cracks in our world. The caves and mines, then, were not homes but doorways, thin spots where the barrier between realities was weaker. This theory found resonance in the strange lights recorded near Helia, glimmers that vanished when approached, as though the air itself had torn open briefly. To others, the goblins were more mundane, yet no less terrifying. An undiscovered species, evolved underground, emerging only when disturbed. Either answer left little comfort. If they were interdimensional, proof might never be captured. If they were native, then they were still here, beneath the hills, waiting. Late one evening, long after the family had gone, 2 investigators returned alone. They set up equipment near the mine, determined to capture whatever they could. For hours, nothing happened. The night was calm, the woods still. Then, near 3, in the morning, their audio picked up a faint rhythm, Tap, tap, tap. At the same moment, the temperature dropped suddenly, visible breath curling in the air. The men swept their flashlights across the trees and saw them. 3 figures, pale and small, standing at the edge of the woods. Their eyes reflected the beams with a steady, unnatural glow. The men froze, adrenaline surging. One raised a camera, hands shaking. The other whispered a prayer. But before either could act, the figures melted back into the shadows, leaving only silence. When the footage was reviewed, nothing remained but blurred shapes, the light catching branches. Once again, the goblins had slipped just beyond reach. By then, Hellier had taken its place beside Kelly in the growing canon of American folklore. Not just a curiosity, not just a headline, but a story retold in whispers, in online forums, in documentaries that never reached the mainstream. For some, it was proof that the world is stranger than we dare admit. For others, it was another case of frightened people misled by darkness. But for those who lived it, who saw the eyes and heard the tapping, it was neither legend nor metaphor. It was real, and it was terrifying. The story did not end in 2012. In the years that followed, similar accounts surfaced from across the Appalachians. Families in West Virginia, Tennessee, and Ohio described pale beings, eyeshine at windows, livestock deaths, strange lights in the hills. The details varied, but the rhythm was the same. A quiet town, a family besieged, skeptics mocking, victims silenced. Again and again, the pattern repeated, as though the goblins moved unseen along the ridges, choosing their stage, testing humanity one household at a time. No one could prove it, but those who studied the pattern began to ask, what if Kelly and Hellier were not anomalies, but warnings? What if this was not a story of isolated fear, but the outline of something larger, something we barely glimpsed? Toward the end of 2012, one final email arrived to the investigators who had first been contacted. It came from a neighboring county, written in the same hurried, desperate tone. They are at our windows too. Please, please help us. Attached was a single photograph, a child's toy lying in the grass, next to small 3-toed prints pressed deep into the soil. The investigators never released the location. They never revealed the family's name. But in private, they admitted it chilled them more than anything they had recorded in Hellier, because it meant the goblins had not stopped. They had simply moved on. And so the story of the Kentucky goblins remains unfinished, a wound that never heals, a shadow that never lifts. From Kelly in 1955 to Hellier in 2012, the pattern persists. A strange light in the sky, pale beings in the night, families driven to terror, and a world too skeptical to believe. Perhaps it is all coincidence, the product of fear, folklore, and isolation. Or perhaps, beneath the hills and hollows of Kentucky, something real stirs, something small, something pale, something that waits. The most chilling possibility is not that they came once or twice, but that they never left. That they are still, here, moving silently beneath our feet, waiting for the night when the tapping begins again. And if that is true, then the question that haunted the Suttons and destroyed the Hellier family remains. Was it merely a one-time terror, or only the beginning of something far darker?